Merry Christmas!
Going into his second season, the training wheels were now off for John Nathan Turner, with Barry Letts no longer on as executive producer and having a new doctor and script editor, he now had free rein. At 30, Peter Davison was by far the youngest actor cast as the Doctor, being only 12 when the show started. Having already become a household name as Tristan in All Creatures Great and Small and for the comedy Sink or Swim, for him this was just a step up in his career.
What was your reaction when you were first asked?
Speechless. I was speechless. In fact, the producer had to phone me back the next day to find out what I actually thought. I really just couldn't think of anything to say. I mean, it was such an astonishing suggestion, really, at first. But it grew on me.
Well, it must have done. I mean, but were you reluctant to take it? Because after all, you can become typecast as Doctor Who, can't you?
Yes, I think actors sometimes get a bit bemused about being typecast. But in the end, I think it just came down to whether I'd enjoy doing it. And I decided, yes, I would.
For his costume they went with a cricket uniform, giving both a gentlemanly nature of the sport, but also an athleticism that his youth would allow. His Doctor would be a lot softer and kinder and vulnerable, in contrast to the more brash and bohemian Doctor before him. This would be at odds with his Doctor having to face some of the show's bloodiest stories. This would be due to Eric Saywood taking over as script editor, whose approach was a lot more violent and cynical than others, but made way for more action pieces. Though this season did carry a hangover from the previous, of there now being 3 companions. Sarah Sutton stayed on as Nyssa despite just being a fill-in for not being able to get Sarah Jane or Leela back. It was intended for her to be written out in the forward to Doomsday, but Davison insisted she stay, so instead she just faints at the end to explain her absence in Kinder.
Doctor,
Nyssa?
This gave her time to renegotiate her contract. The obnoxious and bratty Adric was still around, and still kept siding with the villains. Having not had a great relationship with Baker, Waterhouse started his relationship with Davison by pointing out what he was doing wrong and saying he'd never be as good as Baker. And the loudmouth bossy Tegan was still around and just wanting to get back to Heathrow, despite the attempt to partner with ABC going nowhere. This made the TARDIS team very crowded and writers would struggle to balance them and give them all something to do. At the end of 1981, sci-fi was in a weird place on television. In the weeks before this season premiered, the spin-off K9 & Company had its pilot episode, which did not result in a series, and Blake 7 had finally reached its end at the end of the 4th season, with all of the main characters being massacred. Earlier in the year, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had been made into a TV series to great success, and there was the sci-fi themed game show The Adventure Game. But most significantly, there was the 5 Faces of Doctor Who repeat season. With the larger than usual gap in the wait for the next Doctor, BBC Two repeated a number of serials leading up to this new era of the show.
An adventure which involves the second of the 5 Faces of Doctor Who.
On Mondays to Fridays between the 2nd of November to the 3rd of December. Other than repeats of serials from the recent season around Christmas or over the summer, and exceptions of Evil of the Daleks in 1968 and the rescheduling of An Earthly Child, this was the first time old Doctor Who episodes were rebroadcast by the BBC. This was in large part due to the stripping back of the power of the Equity Union to limit such rebroadcasts. They came to an agreement to allow a small number of repeats, with Doctor Who being one of the first, though it was at this point that fans started to become aware that the past archive was very much incomplete, with the Crotons being the only existing 4-part Troughton. They re-showed An Unearthly Child, the Crotons, Carnival of Monsters, then the 3 Doctors, and Tom Baker's last serial, Logopolis, attracting between 4.3 and 6 million viewers. This was popular enough that the following year they did another repeat season, Doctor Who and the Monsters, on BBC One, though the episodes this time were edited into 50 minutes, including cutting a third of Genesis of the Daleks. But this popularity in sci-fi wasn't all good news. After season 18 was killed in the ratings by Buck Rogers, the decision was made to take Doctor Who out of its Saturday tea time slot and put it bi-weekly on Mondays and Tuesdays. This decision was not very popular, with The Guardian publishing an editorial piece about how this move showed a fundamental misunderstanding of the warmth coming home to Doctor Who on a Saturday afternoon brings. Of course, there was a danger viewership would be affected largely by the child audience that would have clubs and after-school activities during that time. So at around 7 PM, after Nationwide and before So You Think You Know What's Good For You on Mondays and The Question of Sport on Tuesdays, on the 4th of January 1982, the new 5th Doctor premiered.
Someone's manipulating Castrovalva. We're caught in a space-time trap!
Continuing from the end of Legopolis, this is the first time Doctor Who had a pre-title sequence. The Doctor, Tegan and Nyssa escape the police, while Adric is taken by the Master. The first episode is mainly Nyssa and Tegan wandering around a TARDIS, the Doctor still in post-regeneration trauma.
Welcome aboard. I'm the Doctor. Or will be if this regeneration works out.
Until he can meditate in the Zero Room. And this is actually the most interesting part of the story. They escape the Big Bang, which is described as the hydrogen inrush, which is just not what the Big Bang is. More likely they're meaning the birth of the Sun. The second episode is mainly Tegan and Nyssa, who now has a much more practical costume, carrying the Doctor in a box through a forest until they find a castle. Here the Doctor sticks celery into his lapel, which he'd wear for the rest of his run, this likely being JNT's idea that there had to be something odd with the Doctor's costume. Turns out the castle was a creation of the Master, and we see its geometry is all over the place, like MC Escher's painting. The portrait was the Master in disguise. Adric was behind this tapestry and they escape. While Matthew Waterhouse wasn't in this story very much, he did manage to have an erection on camera and threw up from a hangover while filming. Whilst the first part's interesting, this wasn't the strongest of stories to launch the new Doctor.
That's the trouble with regeneration. You never quite know what you're going to get.
It's mostly a fairly dull run around, and whilst there's some interesting visuals, yeah, it just exists. Having left his role as script editor, Christopher H. Bidmead would take his trippy, hard sci-fi conceptualisation with him. Though Castrovalva is a fairly fun, light story, if forgettable for a Doctor's premiere. However, the second story would be a low point. The first Davison story filmed as the originally intended opener Project Zeta Sigma fell through, this one is more of an effects piece. They find themselves in a giant ship headed for Earth with the Umbankans, who have visited before, picking up ancient Greeks, Chinese, Mayans and Aborigines. Janet Fielding insisted they have them speak a real language and not gibberish. Turns out they're all robots and mostly just repeat acts from their culture over and over. Two of the Umbankans changed to look like modern people, and it turns out there are actually 3 billion of them in storage, going to settle on Earth. Also, the leader Monarch thinks he can go back to the start of the universe and become God, which Adric thinks is great. Like Adric before, it was Nyssa's turn to spend much of this story inactive, and, well, we get some interesting designs and cool effects. The Doctor uses a cricket ball to fly through space. It gave us this meme. Yeah, it's not great. It's a pretty dull story and Davison didn't like it, still figuring out the part. This is one of those stories that very much just exists and no one really talks about it, so we're as well moving on.
No! Ah!
This was one that the actors all said they actually really enjoyed, mostly because there was so much more depth, they had more to work with. It starred Richard Todd, making it the first Doctor Who story to feature an Oscar nominee. There's also Johnny Lee Miller in there somewhere. The most obvious theme is of colonialism, the brash military men who disregard the natives because of their cultural differences and lack of language, but their presence starts to corrupt the peaceful people and they start mimicking them. But when they start to lose their minds...
You can't mend people, can you? You can't mend people!
The combination of power and stupidity becomes dangerous.
I have the power of life and death over all of you!
This parallels the Aborigines, but there's also religious themes, most notably the Garden of Eden and the snake that represents temptation and evil. But there's also a lot of Buddhist meanings, with several of the natives being named after Buddhist principles. There's even feminism with the matriarchal aspects.
No male can open the box of jhana without being driven out of his mind, it's well known. Unless... is he an idiot?
This story was studied in depth in Doctor Who The Unfolding Text, the first ever scholarly text on the show by John Tulloch and Manuel Alvarado, which is really worth a read. Frankly, I couldn't do the full analysis of this story justice. You're better going and watching it for yourself if you haven't already, and if you have, watch it again. Of course, having so much thematic depth caused friction between Christopher Bailey and script editor Eric Sayward. There is even a long-standing rumour that it was written by Kate Bush under a pseudonym. This has long since been debunked. One problem it faced was the forest sets, requiring a lot of leaves to cover the studio floor. And, well, the Mara looks crap. Fortunately, the DVD upgrade did it justice. But Peter Grimwade did a great job with the directing, most particularly the dream sequences, which if nothing else will be what you remember from this serial. Such psychodrama wasn't often attempted by a show like Who, so their handling of it was brilliant. And most importantly, it gave Tegan something interesting to do, and added a lot more depth to her character, not just arguing with the Doctor.
I am your strength!
This is today fondly remembered as a fan favourite that tried something incredibly different. Though of course doing something actually intelligent was too much for fans at the time, and in the Doctor Who magazine survey that year it was voted the worst of the season.
Isn't my day, is it?
We come to Davison's first period piece. Set in 1666 at a time of plague, the villagers aren't exactly welcoming of outsiders, but there's more than there seems. They're being controlled and death walks among them, though it's really this colourful robot and they're being run by this lizard, an escaped convict who's one of the last of his kind, a pteroleptil. They thought his plan to spread the plague, but in doing so start the Great Fire of London. Like all period pieces from the BBC, this is very well designed, but also in the sci-fi elements, with some interesting visuals.
Yes?
The pteroleptil mask was the first use of animatronics in Doctor Who, but it's also aided by Michael Robbins as Richard Mace, an actor turned highwayman.
Ah! I'm so impetuous, always looking to the hills and missing the treasure at my feet.
His theatrical flair adds a levity to this story that manages to mix fun adventure with period drama, and by having the regular team split for much of it, it manages to keep the story pacey while giving them all something to do. This story holds a solid place in the rankings. What it is most remembered for, however, is the sonic screwdriver being destroyed. After 14 years on the show, JNT and others felt it had become too much of an ex machina and killed it off.
I feel as though you've just killed an old friend.
It wouldn't appear again in the show until the movie. Written by Eric Sayward, he couldn't also act as script editor, so the role went to Anthony Root, who would do the same on Earthshock. Though it was odd ordering in the season because it would then be followed by another period story.
Why do I always let my curiosity get the better of me?
Again, the BBC does what it does best and gives us a well-designed historical, particularly all the 20s style party costumes. This short two-parter, the first since the Sontaran experiment, stands out as being the pure historical without any sci-fi elements, the first since the Highlanders 15 years earlier, and to this day the last. This would become a recurring point through Davison's seasons to have a two-part period piece, though the following two would have sci-fi elements in them. The TARDIS team land in the 1920s and get invited to a party where Nyssa is the spitting image of the fiancée Anne, and they get up to hijinks. The Doctor gets to put his cricket uniform to use and plays a match. And this is pretty much all part 1 is. It's just a little bit of fun for our characters to get a break and relax.
Anne?
Yes!
Nyssa and Tegan have fun dancing but can't get Adric to join in, he's more interested in his food. Then there's a murder. Turns out the explorer George Cranley returned deformed and mad and so was locked away. He kidnaps Anne, but it's actually Nyssa, and falls off the roof. And that's it. That's the story. It's a very small and, in my opinion, sweet story, though its lack of sci-fi elements and its pretty cheap Agatha Christie style story does not get it much love, and it isn't very highly regarded. As a result, Davison, Fielding and Waterhouse have all said they don't like it, though Sutton likes it, despite how tiring all the costume changes were for the dual role. John Nathan Turner also liked the script and wanted to direct it, but wasn't able to, so the role went to Ron Jones. Ultimately, this was nothing more than a last moment bit of levity before we got to Earthshock. The story starts with the Doctor and Adric arguing, him saying he's found a way back into E-space.
And even if you did, I am not going back into E-space! Then I will find someone who will take me!
The team then land in a cave tunnel where they find themselves in a massacre. It's 2526 and an army are being picked off one by these mysterious robots. Then we end part 1 with a cliffhanger that would live in the ages.
Destroy them!
The Cybermen returned. 7 years since we last saw them in Revenge of the Cybermen, and even that was 6 years after the invasion. We get some clips of their previous meetings with the Doctors.
I imagine you have orders to destroy me.
They made extra sure to keep this reveal secret. They closed the studio viewing galleries during filming and turned down a Radio Times cover feature, having no mention of the Cybermen in the magazine at all. Redesigned to have this more combat overall style body and bulkier head, with the actors' chins now visible, the Cybermen became Doctor Who's answer to stormtroopers, the militaristic force of a faceless army. The story moves to a cargo ship where it turns out the cargo is an army of Cybermen about to attack the Earth. It's on a collision course. Adric spends much of the story trying to break a computer code, and in the end the ship is sent back 65 million years and becomes the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, but Adric stayed aboard.
Well, now I'll never know if I was right.
In a shock ending, Adric dies. He became the 3rd ever companion death, and the first outside of the Daleks' master plan. Though there is Earthshock Part 5, a claymation short added as a feature on the DVD. As a reference to the death of Martha Longhurst in Coronation Street, the credits roll in silence, the only time the Doctor Who theme hasn't been used over the closing, until Rosa in 2018. This action-filled adventure was a great one. They had the captain of the ship who was meant to be a Sigourney Weaver type, which they cast as Beryl Reid, who was a bit confused most of the time. But it's just so filled with action and explosions, and it's great seeing the Cybermen return.
So, we meet again, Doctor.
Even the Doctor gets in on the action. It gave the cast plenty to work with.
Eating a well-prepared meal!
These things are irrelevant.
For some people, small, beautiful events is what life is all about!
This is today a fan favourite and one of the most well-known Classic Who serials, if not just for Adric's death alone.
Sometimes you have to show some depth.
Do you think we should do that?
Well,
kill off Adric, roll the credits over silence.
It was intended to be like a movie, much pacier than a normal TV story. This of course made production very stressful for Peter Grimwade, with episode 4's shooting script alone being 89 pages. He got into frequent arguments with the writer Eric Saywood and composer Malcolm Clarke, even though the distinctive metal-clanging score is great. Drimrade wouldn't direct for Doctor Who again, but he would write, including the very next serial, Time Flight. After the tragic death of Adric, 10 million people tuned in the next week to see the follow-up.
Well, you could do more than grieve. You could go back.
And they just moved on.
You must accept that Adric is dead.
The TARDIS finally gets Tegan to Heathrow 1982, but one of the Concords has disappeared, so they tag along with one to see where it goes. Turns out they're taken through a time disturbance or something to 140 million years ago, where they're psychically tricked into thinking they made it back. But then there's these plasmatons and some soap, and weird stuff, and Nyssa gets possessed, and yeah, this is where it all falls apart. Davison has said that they'd just run out of money on this one, and it ended up looking terrible. Even in rehearsal, they knew it wasn't going to be great. Sutton hated it, not knowing what was going on, and when rewatching it, Fielding said she didn't remember it being so bad. Turns out it's all being orchestrated by this quite racist caricature, Khalid, who turns out to be the Master in Disguise, him playing disguises for the second time. Because of his insistence on always wearing a wig, Anthony Ailey wore a bald cap over his wig. Also, his stuntman almost choked to death on goo. There's also an Adric cameo in the Psychic Visions. This was so that his credit would appear in the Radio Times as to not give away his departure. Turns out the Master's doing some plot to do with these Seraphins, which are actually quite well realised, but God knows what's happening anymore. The crew and passengers of the Concords take off on one and make it back to 1982, and the Master is defeated. While the production values and script may have been down the toilet, the production got special treatment in being the first ever to be given permission to film in Heathrow and on a Concorde, in the absolute freezing cold. But now Tegan's back home, after all that complaining and arguing, the Doctor and Nyssa can leave without her.
Hello, I thought you were going with the Doctor.
So did I.
Oh wait, so now she does want to stay. While season 19 had a rocky start and didn't land the ending, it had a number of strong stories, and was a fresh new feel for a fresh new era of the show. Whilst it was moved to weekdays, the slightly later slot allowed for a bit more maturity, with that bit more action and intelligence behind its stories. Whilst it got muddied in trying to balance so many main characters, this outing for Davison showed him to be a success as the Doctor, contrasting from Baker to give his own unique take on the character, with the viewership consistently managing to stay between 8 to a little over 10 million, getting an average chart position of 53rd, with Time Flight Part 1 getting as high as 26th. At the time, Doctor Who was being broadcast in 39 countries and had an estimated worldwide viewership of 88 million. Over the coming years, this new era for the show, with its franchise appeal and invigorated energy, would only grow that international popularity. Doctor Who had now cemented itself as a legacy programme, with the popularity of the long-time return of the Cybermen and nods to its roots in the Hartnell era with the large cast and links between the stories. The ones behind the camera were now taking it a lot more seriously. This can most clearly be seen by the credit being corrected from Doctor Who to The Doctor after 18 years. Kinder was originally going to end with Sanders and Hindle walking off with the Kinder people holding a flower, but JNT vetoed this for being too camp. And in Fall to Doomsday, the cast wear oxygen masks when they first leave the TARDIS, when the outside environment had long been forgotten by the show. The difference between the approach of the Williams and JNT eras can be summed up by the Pudding Lane sign at the end of the Visitation. This is a small nod that if you get it just adds a bit, but if you don't it doesn't affect anything. It isn't key to understanding the story and doesn't change anything, and it isn't a cutaway from the action. Whereas the Williams era had been postmodern, with this mix of referencing sincerity and expressionism, the John Nathan Turner era had become one of modernism, though this did also mean that parts of the show had become normalised. such as throughout Davison's era they started regularly having guest characters being invited into the TARDIS, with little questioning of its being bigger on the inside.
It's not possible. Quickly, Andrew. You're never going to try and take off.
Nevertheless, this season showed a lot of good promise for Davison and Nathan Turner going forward. Doctor Who was back.